The office tower shuddered with the sound of alarms, screens flickering red as news broke across every outlet. Edward Carter said, "This can't be real." His voice trembled, though his jaw remained tight. Reports screamed of bankruptcy, corporate sabotage and betrayal, twisting his empire into chaos. Employees froze in panic, phones buzzing, whispers colliding in the corridors like waves in a storm. Every eye turned toward the top floor where the CEO stood, the weight of $1 billion empire collapsing onto his shoulders. Trust dissolved, fear sharpened, and his name was already trending with headlines too cruel to ignore. Edward clenched the edge of his desk, staring at collapsing stock values racing across the monitors. Sarah Mitchell, his loyal confidant, whispered, "Edward, we need to act now." He did not answer, his silence more deafening than the alarms. In that moment, his empire became a battlefield, and every second felt like borrowed time. The gamble for survival had already begun. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within as Edward walked into the main floor, every step echoing across the marble. Conversations broke into silence at his presence, eyes shifting nervously, questions unasked but written across every pale face. Edward said, "Return to your work. This company does not fall tonight." His tone carried authority, though his gaze betrayed the storm beneath. Sarah followed closely, her expression rigid, while whispers spread like wildfire through the staff. A junior analyst dropped her pen, hands shaking as rumors swirled. The empire's collapse was no longer numbers on a screen. It was fear alive in the air. Edward felt their stares, a jury of thousands watching his next move, yet his face betrayed no weakness. His silence, sharper than words, drew a line between leader and lost man. In the boardroom again, the weight of betrayal seeped through the walls like a hidden toxin. Edward faced his executives, their eyes darting away, avoiding the sharpness of his glare. "Who fed this information out?" Edward demanded, his voice steady yet edged with fury. Silence answered him, the kind that speaks of secrets and guilt. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her gaze searching the faces of men who once swore loyalty. A projector flickered with headlines, painting Edward's empire as prey ready to be devoured. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the table, forcing control over rage. The storm outside cracked with thunder, as if the city itself echoed the collapse brewing within. The media frenzy exploded as cameras crowded outside the building, shouting questions with flashing lights like relentless sparks. Edward watched the scene from the top floor window, jaw clenched, voice low. "They smell blood," he muttered. Sarah stood behind him, phone pressed to her ear, attempting to contain the narrative, her tone firm yet strained. Reporters hurled accusations, screens across the city broadcasting live chaos. The company name was no longer a symbol of power but scandal, its letters dragged through digital mud. Edward's reflection stared back at him in the glass, a man framed as villain or survivor depending on tomorrow's headlines. The storm outside was no louder than the storm in his chest. Night deepened, but Edward found no rest. He stood in his private office, the silence thick, broken only by the hum of machines and the steady rhythm of rain. On his desk lay contracts, reports, and a framed photo of better days. His fingers brushed the frame before pulling away, eyes dark with weight. "Everything they built with me, they now conspire to destroy," he whispered. Sarah entered quietly, hesitation in her steps, and said, "You can still turn this around, Edward." He turned toward her slowly, expression unreadable, his silence a wall between them. Beyond the glass, lightning carved the sky, a reminder that storms do not end quietly. The rival made his move with calculated precision, striking while Edward's empire reeled. Victor Hale, the manipulative rival CEO, appeared on every major network with a smug calm that ignited fury in Edward's chest. "The industry deserves stability, and I will deliver it," Victor declared, his words slicing through the air like blades. Edward watched from his office, fists clenched, veins tightening under his skin as the betrayal spread across glowing screens. Sarah whispered, "He's painting you as reckless." Edward's silence thundered louder than anger, his stare locked on Victor's smirk. The war for survival was no longer behind closed doors. It was broadcast for the world to see. Each second Victor spoke pushed Edward closer to the edge, and every whisper in the building felt like a betrayal waiting to bloom. Sarah stood at Edward's side, her voice steady though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "We can fight this, but only if you stop isolating yourself," she urged. Edward turned toward her slowly, his face cast in shadows from the monitors. His silence was more cutting than words, yet his eyes revealed the war between pride and survival. "You still have loyal people," Sarah pressed, her voice trembling with urgency. Edward finally muttered, "Loyalty bends when power crumbles." She stepped closer, refusing to yield, her presence the last anchor in his collapsing storm. For a fleeting moment, Edward let the weight show on his shoulders, then straightened with renewed fire. The storm outside raged louder, yet within that room, Sarah's words became the spark that refused to die. Rumors spread through the office corridors like wildfire, whispers of sabotage that no one dared voice openly. Edward strode through the main floor, his presence silencing conversations mid-sentence. "If someone is feeding them information, I will find out," he said, his tone sharp and unyielding. Eyes darted away, avoiding the burn of his gaze, as if guilt lived in every corner. Sarah watched quietly, sensing the cracks widening in their foundation. A junior executive fumbled with files, sweat on his brow betraying fear. The air carried suspicion thicker than smoke, every shadow a potential traitor. Edward's steps echoed with menace, each one hammering the message that trust had become a rare commodity. Betrayal was no longer a rumor. It was a certainty waiting to surface. In a quiet lounge, Edward met Richard Coleman, the disillusioned mentor who had once ruled the same empire. Richard's voice was raspy, worn from years of battles fought and lost. "I warned you. Ambition consumes more than it gives," he said, his eyes hollow with memory. Edward leaned forward, tension visible in his jaw. "And what would you have me do? Surrender?" Richard chuckled bitterly. "No, but remember, every empire collapses from within before it falls to enemies outside." The words landed heavy, striking deeper than Edward wished to admit. Sarah observed silently, her expression caught between worry and respect. The old wounds of ambition were laid bare, and Edward realized his war was not only against rivals, but against the ghosts of those who failed before him. The shadow investor revealed their hand with subtle menace, sending a letter marked confidential directly to Edward's desk. The words were few but sharp: "Support me, or lose everything." Edward read it twice, the weight pressing harder than the storm outside. Sarah stood nearby, tension clear in the lines of her face. "They're forcing your hand," she said, voice low. Edward exhaled slowly, crushing the paper in his fist, his eyes fixed on the skyline where rain still lashed the glass. "Then they've underestimated me," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the strain. For the first time, Edward felt the invisible strings tightening around him, pulled by a power lurking in the shadows, unseen but undeniable. Morning arrived with the dull ache of consequence, and the building felt colder than the rain had ever made it. Edward scanned overnight reports, each line a bruise on the balance sheet that refused to fade. Sarah said, "There's a mismatch in treasury flows." He lifted his eyes, the silence between them weighted like lead. She added, "Numbers shifted after midnight, routed through an internal gate." Edward said, "No external breach does that." The words tasted like iron. In the corridor, voices thinned as he walked, dread pacing beside him like a shadow. Screens glowed with red bars and broken promises, yet he kept his stride measured. He felt a private certainty bite down hard. Betrayal was not an intruder outside. It lived at a trusted desk within arm's reach. The finance floor held its breath as Edward and Sarah entered Treasury Control. Claire Donovan, the CFO, looked up from a console with careful calm. Edward said, "We have a routing anomaly." Claire smiled thinly and asked, "Is this another rumor hunt?" Sarah set a printout down, neat as a blade. Edward said, "Keys were used at 2:14, then mirrored." Claire's eyebrow flicked, fast and almost proud. She said, "If you trusted process, you would not chase ghosts." The room listened like a jury that feared the verdict. Edward kept his gaze level, but fury traveled his pulse in sharp beats. The gap between loyalty and ambition narrowed to a single fearful breath. Logs unraveled a hidden path, pointing to a name that should have been clean. John Hayes appeared in the corridor, pale and breathless, clutching an access card like a burning coal. John said, "Someone cloned my token." His voice frayed at the edges. Sarah said, "Show us when you last used it." He nodded, shame fighting with fear as he pulled up timestamps. Edward watched the pattern bloom into a deliberate map. Claire hovered at the doorway, arms folded, eyes dry as winter stone. Edward said, "Cloned tokens need help from inside." The corridor seemed to tilt, and a hush settled like frost. Trust, once bright, dulled to a knife's sheen. Edward convened a closed session in the small strategy room, where the walls knew the taste of secrets. He laid out mirrored transfers, vendor shells, and a timeline that landed like a hammer. Claire said, "Your empire is failing and you need a villain." Her tone curled with practiced poise. Sarah answered, then explained these approvals. The projector painted cold light across faces grown older by fear. Edward said, "You built exits before the fire began." Claire's smile thinned to a wire. She said, "Survival favors the prepared." The sentence rang like a creed. Edward felt the room tighten as if the air had learned to choke. The line between defense and confession blurred to smoke. The confrontation broke in the boardroom where victories once drank champagne. Edward said, "You sold our lifeline to Victor." The name fell like a verdict. Claire met his stare without blinking. She said, "I sold rot to the surgeon who can cut it out." Sarah said, "You bled us to prove a point." Claire lifted a folder and slid it forward with elegance that felt cruel. Inside lay contracts, side letters, and a promise of control shifting hands by dawn. Edward felt the empire tilt, but he did not step back. He said, "You will answer for this, and you will not write the ending." The storm outside resumed its drum, faithful and merciless, as if keeping time for a fall. Edward gathered intelligence like a soldier preparing for war, combing through every trace of data and whisper of betrayal. Sarah said, "We need proof that Victor orchestrated this." Edward replied, "Proof is never enough. Leverage decides outcomes." Files stacked like ammunition on his desk, each page a bullet aimed at enemies circling closer. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum of machines. Edward's eyes burned, but his resolve hardened with every detail uncovered. He traced money trails, secret accounts, and hidden deals. The evidence painted a picture too cruel to ignore. Edward said, "When the moment comes, they will choke on their own weapons." His empire was bleeding, yet he sharpened the blade for his counterstrike. In the chaos, the underdog emerged. Michael Reed, a junior analyst dismissed too often, approached Edward with shaking hands. "I found something," he said, sliding a drive across the table. Edward raised an eyebrow, studying the young man. Michael continued, "Shell companies linked to Victor and Claire, hidden through offshore routes." Sarah leaned closer, astonished at the detail. Edward said, "You've just altered the battlefield." Michael's voice wavered, but determination anchored his tone. "They underestimated me, and they underestimated you." Edward felt a flicker of respect for the overlooked employee who had become an unexpected ally. In a war of giants, the smallest voice had struck hardest. Courtrooms became new battlegrounds as Edward launched legal maneuvers. Dressed in dark resolve, he strode through marble halls with Sarah and Michael close behind. Cameras flashed like gunfire, reporters shouting accusations. Inside, Edward sat before polished oak, his lawyers flanking him with sharpened arguments. Victor's team entered with arrogance carved across their faces. Edward's silence spoke louder than any words, his presence a warning that the fight was far from over. Contracts, evidence, and whispers of corruption filled the air like smoke. The gavel struck, signaling the opening of a war no stock chart could capture. Edward's gamble had shifted into the public arena, and the world would now watch his survival unfold in law and spectacle. Inside the company walls, rebellion brewed. Employees gathered in hushed clusters, their faith torn by scandal and betrayal. Some demanded Edward's resignation, voices trembling with anger. Others whispered loyalty, clinging to his iron will. Edward addressed them in the atrium, his tone steady. "You think this empire was built on fear. It was built on survival." His words cut through murmurs, leaving a hush in their wake. Sarah scanned the crowd, recognizing division deepening like cracks in glass. Michael whispered, "If they splinter, Victor wins without lifting a finger." Edward's jaw set hard, his authority carried on every syllable. The rebellion was a test of leadership sharper than any boardroom wall. The media tide began to shift, reporters sensing cracks in Victor's narrative. Headlines flickered on screens with cautious neutrality, no longer declaring Edward's demise. Edward watched broadcasts from his office, Sarah at his side. Michael scrolled through feeds muttering, "They're questioning Victor's accounts." Edward allowed the smallest hint of a smile. "Doubt is the first victory," he said quietly. Sarah placed a hand on the desk, her eyes steady. "But it won't hold unless we keep pressing." Outside, storm clouds thinned as dawn began to rise, a fragile light pushing against the darkness. Edward knew the war was still burning. But for the first time in weeks, the tide leaned in his favor. The counterstrike had begun. Dawn arrived with cruel arithmetic, and the balance sheet finally screamed. Edward stared at liquidity calls stacked like dominoes across the hour. Sarah said, "Vendors are demanding prepayment." His reply was a whisper of steel. "We buy time." Lines of credit shrank as if the walls learned to breathe inward. Michael traced cash sweeps, his finger shaking at each red mark. Edward said, "Prioritize payroll and core ops." Sarah nodded, eyes bright with strain and faith. Victor surfaced on business channels, promising stability while smiling like a blade. Edward refused the screen and faced the numbers. Pride had no currency here, only hours and courage. The boardroom gathered like a tribunal, and silence cut deeper than questions. Edward said, "We hold, we restructure, we fight." Claire folded her hands with unhurried grace. She said, "We vote to remove you for cause." Sarah said, "You engineered this collapse." Claire did not blink. Contracts slid across the table with ceremonial cruelty. Edward read the clauses that turned breath into daggers. He said, "This is Victor's script." A director cleared his throat and asked for order that no heart could obey. The vote felt pre-written, each nod a nail. Edward stood taller, so his fall would not teach them weakness. After the vote, the corridor stretched like a verdict without end. Sarah caught up, breath tight, voice raw. "I failed you," she said, eyes refusing to break. Edward shook his head once. "You kept me standing." Michael approached with a folder that trembled in his hands. "An injunction is possible, but the window is minutes." Sarah's resolve cracked, not from fear, but from too many nights holding back a tide. She said, "Tell me what to do, and I will do it." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture brief and heavy. "Hold the team, guard the truth." He walked on as if the floor learned mercy. Victor claimed the airwaves and the market with a single elegant blow. He announced emergency financing for select assets, but only if leadership changed. "Stability first," Victor said, making ruin sound like rescue. Shareholders cheered in numbers that hurt to hear. Edward watched the chart spike for the wrong reasons. Sarah said, "If they accept his terms, we lose the core." Michael whispered, "He will strip and sell within a quarter." Edward closed his eyes for the length of a breath. He said, "Then we sever the limb to save the life." The words tasted like ash and medicine. The sacrifice arrived as a quiet document that weighed more than steel. Edward drafted a sale of the legacy division, the heart that made his name more than letters. Sarah said, "This will break you." He answered, "It will keep them paid." Michael placed the buyer's confirmation on the desk. hands steady at last. Edward signed with a pen that felt like a blade. He said, "We trade history for tomorrow." The room did not applaud, and the storm did not end. Yet the numbers aligned just enough to breathe. In that breath, Edward understood the cost of survival and took it. The shadow investor finally revealed themselves with a voice colder than stone. Edward read the ultimatum, delivered through a private call. "Either align with me or watch Victor dismantle you entirely." Sarah's face darkened as she whispered, "They own more than we knew." Edward paced the office, every step striking the floor like a drumbeat of dread. He said, "If I submit, I lose everything. If I resist, I risk total annihilation." Michael leaned in, voice firm for once. "Then gamble, sir. It's the only move left." The storm outside raged in rhythm, with the tension inside. Edward clenched his jaw and said, "I will not bend. I will wager everything on one last strike." Edward summoned Sarah and Michael into the war room, the screens alive with maps of data, contracts and leverage. "We risk everything now," Edward declared, voice steady as steel. Sarah said, "If this fails, we don't recover." Edward looked at her, eyes burning. "If we don't try, we're already dead." Michael displayed a chart, tracing connections of Victor's shell companies. Edward slammed his palm on the table. "We'll expose him, tie his empire to fraud, and cripple his support." Sarah's eyes held a mix of fear and admiration. She whispered, "This is no longer survival. This is a gamble that will burn the world." Edward's silence confirmed it. The confrontation erupted in Victor's gleaming office tower. Edward entered with Sarah and Michael at his side, silence wrapping them like armor. Victor rose, lips curved with triumph. "You're late to your own funeral," he sneered. Edward said, "No, I came to write yours." Claire appeared from the shadows, folder in hand, her betrayal glowing like poison. Sarah hissed, "You planned this with him." Claire smirked. "Power belongs to those who dare." Edward placed a stack of evidence on Victor's desk. "And fraud belongs to you." The air crackled with fury as alliances shattered. The war had left whispers behind. Now it was fire. Tension boiled into chaos. Voices collided, contracts slammed, accusations hurled like weapons. Victor shouted, "Your empire is dead." Edward countered, "Not before yours burns first." Claire leaned in, hissing, "Hell never wins, Sarah. You chose the wrong man." Sarah fired back, "I chose loyalty." Michael pushed forward evidence streams that tied Victor to corruption. Edward raised his voice above the storm. "Every lie you built is collapsing tonight." The storm outside howled against the glass as if echoing the violence inside. The gamble had reached its boiling point, and only fire could cleanse what remained. The final showdown left silence like ash in the room. Edward stood tall, though sweat dampened his collar. Victor glared, but his smirk had cracked, the evidence weighing down his empire. Claire clenched her jaw, realizing her schemes had backfired. Sarah whispered, "You turned the tide." Michael's eyes gleamed with rare confidence. Edward exhaled slowly, his voice heavy but unbroken. "This gamble will decide everything, and I've placed all I have on survival." The storm outside began to ease, but the war inside was far from finished. This was not victory, not yet, but the battlefield had shifted, and Edward Carter remained standing. Dawn broke like a verdict that refused theatrics. The markets opened to confusion, but not collapse, and the building exhaled a wary breath. Sarah said, "Regulators want your files by noon." Edward nodded and answered, "They will get truth, not theater." Michael reported that Victor's backers were retreating, their calls suddenly polite. Claire's lawyers sent a notice that read brave, but smelled of retreat. Edward walked the halls, collecting stares that carried both doubt and gratitude. He said, "We survive today by earning tomorrow." The words felt smaller than the cost, yet steadier than hope. Edward met Richard in a quiet corner that still remembered deals made with handshakes. Richard said, Survival is a bill that never forgets its debtor. Edward answered, "Then I will pay and work, not pride." The older man studied him, eyes like worn stone that had seen every tide. "Your fall was earned by those who wanted your crown," Richard said, "but your balance is yours to right." Sarah stood near, weighing the counsel and the scars. Edward thanked him without ceremony and turned toward the noise that needed him. The future would not forgive delay, and neither would payroll. Negotiations unfolded like surgery with dull instruments. Edward faced creditor heads across a table too polished for mercy. He said, "Keep the company breathing, and you recover more than ash." A chairwoman replied, "We want proof of discipline, not speeches." Sarah slid new covenants forward, tight as stitches that hold through pain. Michael detailed controls that closed every gate Claire once opened. The room cooled from threat to calculus. Edward held his ground without drama and let the numbers do the speaking he could not afford to waste. News broke like a slow thaw. Regulators opened a probe into Victor's deals, and investors smelled smoke where polish once gleamed. Edward read the alert in silence, then said, "We do not gloat, we work." Sarah's shoulders eased, but her focus did not. Michael whispered, "He will fight this on every channel." Edward answered, "Then we will not watch the channels." The staff felt the shift, not as victory, but as a corridor with lights turning on. The empire was still fragile, yet it stood. Evening settled over the city like a bandage that promised only time. Edward stood in his office with the lights low, and the files aligned for tomorrow. Sarah said, "You won a day that could hold a future." He answered, "I lost pieces that will not grow back." Michael lingered in the doorway, uncertain whether to celebrate or plan. "Ow." Edward looked at the skyline that once reflected only certainty. He said, "We live with the cost and pay forward." The room held the quiet that follows a storm, and a pulse that sounded like work.